I would like to invite the committee member to read a disclaimer that we reread before every testimony, which is an important element of the day. If you could please rise. It's a privilege and an honor to have the witnesses here with us today, although we are aware of the distance they had to travel in the hope for justice, when we know that justice cannot yet be achieved. However, we thank all of the witnesses, Jewish and Palestinian alike, that have agreed to take part and to make steps to make this happen. You are the most important people in the room. We have done everything we can in order to maintain your well-being, but we know that our efforts are not complete. We will keep the private details of your lives confidential, as we know that especially in these days of war and racism, it is a courageous step to come forward and tell the stories of the Nakba. Your stories will inform the recommendations that we in the committee make. We will also keep you informed of everything that happens after, to accept your feedback. And we have with us Judy Inas and Nadir that are here to accompany the witnesses and the committee to make sure that everyone's dignity remains intact. The Truth Committee is a civil society initiative. It is not a formal body. It's not affiliated with any state institution or body, and it has no legal authority. It does not also have the authority to pay reparations or to agree to amnesty or any other authority that some truth committees are mandated to do in the world. Thank you so much. Hey, Safa, I have the honor to hear from you now. We're all experts today. Everybody's experts on their own particular story, but you're also an expert because you're a researcher. Do you want us to turn off the light for your presentation, or does anybody? No, we're fine. Okay, fantastic. Thank you for inviting me here. Usually, what I'm going to present to you is based on a thesis or a dissertation and PhD dissertation research that really expresses the voice of the generation of 1948, the Nakba generation. And unlike academic conferences, which had also become very hostile in the last period because they represent, you know, the zeitgeist and the spirit of the day, I'm thrilled to be here today because I think that there's a statement and a position, an expression of position, actually, to have the Truth Commission here in the Negev, particularly when we're fighting for the land and dealing with an issue which is so important, so impactful on the lives of almost a quarter of the Negev population, but actually for all of the population of the Negev, Arab and Jewish alike. And I'm very glad that there's both Arabs and Jews who came to here today, and that there are testimonies from both Arab and Jewish witnesses. And also we're hearing from researchers such as myself. I'm going to present to you my research, or some part of my research. I deliberated in what language to speak. My environment, the people around me, all told me to speak in Hebrew. I brought quotes both in Arabic and in Hebrew. I believe that the initial audience that we must actually convince are the Jewish Israelis, the unconvinced, not the people who are in the room, and therefore I actually chose in the end to speak in Hebrew, but I also show the citations in Arabic, as I said. I am going to voice the opinions of the Nakba generation, the 1948 generation, the people whose lives and the repercussions of which we live with today, and talk about the fight of the Negev from a completely different perspective. Basically, the fight for the Negev is a fight for the identity of the place. It's a long-term conflict which revolves around a few key issues, which really bring to light key issues that have to do with belonging and memory and who's this land, who owns this land. Usually owners there should be exclusivity only to single owners. Who belongs to the land, particularly who does not belong to the land, who owns the past of this land and who owns the future of this land. And I think that the more the native researchers such as myself and others examine to more in depth the voices of the 1948 generation, maybe we'll be able to balance out the academic research in the field and other mechanisms that work to exclude the Arab Bedouin voices from this discourse and blacken really the identity of those who should be, so to speak, excluded from the discourse, which is the Bedouins as it's done today. My research question that I chose to focus on both in my master's and PhD dissertations was to examine the impact of 1948, the actual uprooting from the land on the shaping of the identity of Arabs of the Negev. I mostly, in my initial research, interviewed men. Then in my PhD research, I mostly interviewed women, particularly from recognized villages and unrecognized villages, Khabal Aj, people who had bought lands or had not bought lands, had stayed in the area and remained without land. And I tried particularly among the women to speak to as many as I can, black women and white women, and really examine the significance of life in the land and being uprooted from the land on the overall population. Anybody who lived here before 1948 has a story to tell, a narrative that is worth hearing, I believe. And I have to remark, and I heard the difficulties of bringing women's testimonies, particularly in what happened before 1948. I have an entire chapter in my doctorate. I'm an anthropologist, so we also talk about the process of research. So an entire chapter of mine is dedicated to the entrance into these women's territories. When I interviewed men and had to enter the men's territories, for example, I had to be helped by my father, so that, and being, accompanied by my father to talk to the Arabs, particularly to the older Arabs who were born in before 1948. When I got to these men, usually the initial interview was, a one-on-one interview of maybe an hour, and afterwards I began to accumulate the women and the brothers and the children started joining the interviews, and they started talking amongst themselves the stories of the past and how it impacts them and the way in which they heard about those past stories and how it has shaped their identity. When I talked to my women in my doctoral dissertation, I had a great difficulty even talking to these women, finding these women, because they constantly objected. They said, we don't know how to talk about history. Talk to our husbands, talk to my brother, talk to my uncle, talk to my father, to my, talk to the men, for example, because we don't know, we women don't know how to tell history, don't remember, we're illiterate, we're not the agents of history, don't have the information that you're looking for. After a lot of efforts, I finally managed, through my students, to get into those areas, those women's arenas, so to speak, and begin to talking to the Bedouin women, particularly in the morning hours I would manage. And there the interviews, again, were very collective, which is, again, representative of the Bedouin Arab culture here in the Negev. It was never a one-on-one discussion with one woman. Women basically were talking amongst themselves. I would pose a question, and I would say something like, tell me the story of your lives, very general question. And they would talk to each other, basically, and tell about how they'd lived in the past, how their daughters or sisters or women who had been born after 1948 had heard their stories being told and how it had impacted them. The story was always circular, narrative, and also evolved through the conversation. The testimonies include the generation of 1948, the entire decade of that period, also people who, their children, and even sometimes their grandchildren, but also other additional family members that also added their voices to the general collection of narratives. I'm not going to get into the details of this too much, but as a researcher, I have to tell you about the context of my research. One of the key conflicts and struggles in the Negev over land surrounds the question of who defines us. Oftentimes, we are defined by the institution. institution. I'm only going to bring a tiny, tiny section of my research. It's not archaeological, it's not archival materials, but things that I've looked at, read, and documented of what's been written about us. For many years, the Bedouins here in the Negev were researched by Western researchers and Israeli researchers. Only recently, in the last, say, 20, 30 years, have Arab researchers come to examine the Bedouin identity here in the Negev. And only a few weeks ago, we published a book what was called Bedouins and Colonialism, which brings the voice of the Bedouins from a native point of view, meaning trying to show not only a political and social stance that we are trying to voice their voice in the and from the first meaning from the first level, and not through any kind of other prism or screening. I sat, as I said, for many hours in libraries, reading, researching, and archiving, and examining in a critical way how the academic institution views the Bedouins in the Negev. And I'm really giving you the tip of the iceberg because I want to talk to the testimonies themselves. So 1948 to 1960, under the military rule that were here, the Bedouins were described in the academic work as nomadic, as homogeneous, as a static culture, and primitive. In 1967, the first settlement, the first permanent settlement of Bedouins, Tel Sheva, was established, and now academic research begins to document the shift from the primitive culture into the modern, noble world, which is represented obviously by Israeli culture and Israeli values, and through the establishment of these permanent settlements, whereby these permanent settlements, they reflect these moral values that the Jewish institutions have instated in order to make the Bedouins more modern. These studies, I can say this out loud, are delusional, orientalist, and colonialist in nature, talking about the fact that now Bedouins have TV. They also talk about the dismemberment of the tribal structure of the clan, and it's all through Western eyes that use through their knowledge categories and their view of what is modern and what is primitive and what is good and what is bad for the Bedouins. At the moment, we know now that every knowledge is political and screened through our political views, and through the examination and through the choice of research questions, hypotheses in research arenas, we have a biased or slanted way into researching any kind of field. So this is very sort of, that's the kind of approach there was in 1967 and onwards, particularly with everything that has to do with planning and the education of women, because particularly in democratic country, use the modern woman as a symbol of modernity. And this was the key point that Bedouin women began learning. They began going to school, and so there was this end view that we are good for the Bedouins. And I hear from scholars many oftentimes, without us, I mean, they would have stayed in those primitive ways of life. It's important to know that academic research is part of a range of mechanisms of exclusion, part of which are pointed to the mechanism to the people of the Negev, and demonization and discrimination, showing people as landless, showing people as uprooted. But obviously, in any research, my research as well, is through this political screen. From 1980 till today, we see a great more critical research, as we still see the Orientalist studies being done, but now we see another. And when there was quite a big clash when I submitted my PhD dissertation, because I didn't mention, for example, the fact that the Bedouins are nomadic. And then you have to, of course, I had to add this fact, for example. It was one kind of little problem that I'm just sort of highlighting. So from 1980 till today, we see a lot more researchers, also Jewish, Israeli, and also Arabs, that are giving a more critical view on critical research about the Bedouins, about their structure, that the villages, the permanent settlements have failed, that they don't have employment, and were established basically in order to separate the Bedouins from their heritage and their connection to the land, and concentrate them in as much small an acreage as they could. I just remark now that the academic research is part of an overall range of mechanisms, as I've already mentioned, and legal and planning or city planning research-oriented studies studies are particularly noted to be rooted in these kind of Western values, how we can teach these Bedouins to live and adapt themselves to the rural when they show this kind of planning principles in line with the Israeli Western ideology. But I think also the planning and also legal discourse has to do with how do we basically save or redeem the land from the chaos left by the Bedouins, which is very different actually from the original Zionist views that we're initially talking about. So these kind of discourses and the Israeli public discourse, but also the legal, academic, and also the planning, the city planning academic, not only are people unaware of the connection of the Bedouins to the Negev, I think there's a disinformation here which is based more than anything on academic information which only shows one side of the story and expunges basically the other side of the story. And within all of these discourses and mechanisms, the Bedouins, first of all, are presented not as Arabs. They're Bedouin, they're not Arabs. They have a lot of folklore. They know how to make great coffee and they have great, hospitality. They are primitive, they are chaotic. This is meaning these are the kind of adjectives that are used in order to describe them, and need the redemption and the saving of the Jewish Israelis that show us the way to modernity, meaning they are shown as without connection to the earth. And here I ask myself the question, particularly when I also was raised in a Jewish and Arab school, and in the Jewish school, particularly in history classes, we were taught that this was a land without a people and a people without a land, and that this land was empty and there's no such thing as the Palestinian people, and the Jews came here and saved the land. And when my grandfather would take us to his lands and showed us where he came from, it completely clashed with my history classes with the lessons that I learned in formal schools. At the time there was no Google and internet and Wikipedia. I had the written classes that I was taught in school, and I had the oral traditions that were taught to me by grandfather, and they were totally head to head as a complete clash. They completely operated. And this completely confused me as a child. This conflict, this tension between the oral history that I heard from home and my father's testimonies, which showed me which land we had come from and what land we'd been on, and the formal history that I went to school with and been taught there. And this really made me ask a question and wonder very profoundly on the question as who defined us, who is right, who is wrong, how can we define ourselves? And I decided to use research, first of all, for myself, but also it became a more ideological goal, first of all, in order to understand and know about my identity, my history, and document it. And also particularly when I read the Palestinian history there as well, I didn't understand very much documentation about the Bedouin history of the Negev, and that's why I decided to embark on this journey. As I said, in regards to the spatial discussion about the Bedouins in the Negev, it's really expressed in several levels. I'm going to really focus today on the non-formal discourse, some of which we've already shown today, which documents the voice of the generation of 1948, the majority of which is an oral tradition. It's told from one generation to the next. It's not documented and written down. Sadly, I'm one of the few cases in which I'm documenting such a tradition, but sadly there's a legitimization, at least socially, not academically so much, but socially, yes, to deal and focus with the documentation of such voices. Now, the spatial discourse in the Negev, and I'm going to talk about my findings, really are seen in two levels. On the one hand, providing a structure for the sense of belonging of the Negevs and their heritage and tradition and connection to the land. And a second, the question of alienization in regards to the space in which they inhabit. Now, I really don't going to talk about the theoretical basis, but I would just say that I base myself to a great degree on a term that's called sense of place. Sense of place or identity of place really talks about the fact that a space is not only a geographical, physical arena, a territory, but rather also an emotional place that talks about our memories, our personal experiences, our lives in the past. And we connect between our personal emotions and our lives in the past, and really shows how it shapes our sense of belonging to the place. A sense of belonging to the place, as we've said, also defines our need to belong, and is structured and built not only through memory, but also through various spatial practices that I will examine in a moment that really give presence to our past in the present. Okay? Among the Arab Bedouins, I found that women and men alike have consistently and continuously, I'm talking my two grandfathers. I have one grandfather from Lubia, from an uprooted village in the north next to Tiberias, which afterwards they were expelled north, and then my other grandfather from the south. So I experienced the shift from the area where where they were sent, the oral history of one grandfather from the north who was sent to a place without water, without heat, without anything, and then my southern grandfather who was shifted basically deeply into the eastern parts of the desert and his oral tradition. So the sense of place among the Bedouin is in the Negev is really transmitted by four key practices. The first is the story of the place. The second is the visits to the ancestral sites. The third is use of proof such as maps and so forth. And the fifth, finally, is the testimonials themselves.
As I said, the Arab Bedouin narrative, when I interviewed both men and women, I asked them to tell them their story, that amongst all of them, there were three main leitmotifs and themes that sort of came up. All of those were actually tracing the memory of that land. Land was always something central. It was geographical, it was physical, but it was also emotional. It was something that they belonged to. The fact that they were expelled from their land, that was the order in which they always told their past. And of course, the el-Auda, the return to their land, not only in their conscious, but also the physical one. In other words, not only the emotional one, also that actually sense, that building and the structuring of that actually belonging to that land, as well as the actual physical return to the location, to their actual land. So I focused from 48 to 52, and so they told in the way they sort of tell their oral history, that is always from, one person to the next. And now they were going to tell us about the story of the actual place. Now, there's a difference between the way men tell history and how women tell history. Now, don't look at the quotations for a moment. The men say it in a very orderly way, that it was always that they were following. They've got very clear names of army people who expelled us. The women, the first sentence was always, when I asked them, tell me the story of your lives, was in Arabic. She's saying that we were working the land. In other words, we were working with the olives, we were working with the trees, we were working with the fields, and that was their immediate bond with the actual land. That was the first thing that immediately came to mind, the most salient of all. So all of them, after they told me where they came from, they immediately mentioned the place where they were displaced from, and only after that they explained in an Israeli language, we are from this and this, beside this and this kibbutz. In other words, the discourse enveloped two things. First of all, where do we come from with the historical names? And the second part was for the Israeli audience, so that they would understand that it's under the auspices of that specific kibbutz or that specific area. They always told me about their ownership of land, and there were a couple of types of ownership of land. There's a traditional ownership of land, and that's the second thing that is mentioned. In other words, we conquered the land many years ago, hundreds of years ago, but it's forbidden to sell land as a Bedouin. You're not allowed to sell it, and therefore there's a kind of the emotional belonging. In other words, so the first place that my head touched when I was born was my land. In other words, that is a kind of emotional bond with it. And of course, it is actually, she says it's written there, sorry, she didn't actually read it out. So the men describe their land as a mother. It's their motherland. It is the basic, the foundation, the pillars, something that if you cannot actually preserve it and guard it, then what can a person do? It's like they cannot guard their mother. After all, it is their honor. that is what the men then say. As far as they're concerned, the land has the significance and the meaning of a status symbol as well. Women, after all, there is a specific kind of class society there. We're talking about people who've come from 400 years ago. It's a little easier now in the modern age, but it's very difficult for women who come from specific tribes for hundreds and hundreds of years. They find it very difficult to actually marry men that were not landowners, because that really substantiates the true deep meaning of the status symbol of having land, of owning land, and that is a social hierarchy. And therefore, even now, it creates social problems because they're not even now not willing to marry men who do not own land. Now, after the story about what kind of lives we lived with our land, the terminology that the witnesses were using was very, very rigid, very difficult terminology. They describe the expulsion as something, they don't use Nakba or those academic terms, but rather that we had to run for our lives, that we were thrown out. As far as they were concerned, the expulsion means, as far as they were concerned, was that Beersheba fell apart. It was dismantled, that they managed to conquer it. That is a symbol. That was the point in time wherein the actual expulsion started. And then we understood that we're on our way out. And they also actually mention the status issue, the kind of class symbol, in other words, that they ran away barefoot while we ran away with our animals and other things, and we managed. In other words, the whole time, the classes always compare themselves. In other words, the various strata, the socioeconomic strata, as if those who are allowed to run with something and those who actually run away with barefoot. We kept trying to stay behind. We tried to come back. People weren't allowed to. It was forbidden of us to actually come back. It was the Jews told us, so they even shot at us, and they promised us that they would be able to go back after the kind of military maneuver. It was a leitmotif. They said you can come back after 40 days. But the whole time, what we saw is how we actually did maneuver and train on our land, and then it became a closed-off military area that no one was. It was actually prohibited to actually go into. In other words, what they're basically saying, that our land was raped. That's the terminology that they're using. The significance of land, they are comparing it to a mother or a wife that should be preserved and mollycoddled and truly looked after. This is a patriarchal society wherein land is that woman, because that is their honor, that is their dignity. And through the women, the men, we see the chronological, actually, events. But the women, we see the impact of the expulsion on their internal lives and what happened. And it's a very, very significant difference. As an anthropologist, I understood how they actually lived and existed in the past and how they live nowadays, and what is the significance of land nowadays, even more so to the women than it is to the men. And I'm a feminist, but when they talk about history, and that is the actual gender significance when we hear about the documentation of women and the documentation of man, to understand the differences in their relationship and their bond with land. The first thing that I was actually told by the women and by the men as well is that it was a loss of values. And they said that for us, it was from the moment they blurred the gender kind of borders and frontiers. What did it really mean in that? Once there was a sheikh who was he was everything to us. There was just one world. Nowadays, the dignity, but now everyone can say anything they want. In other words, the whole kind of social structures felt they were dissolved. They were really toppled, and everything changed. That was a cultural meaning, as far as they're concerned, when they lost their land. And we're talking about the social structure that was lost. In other words, we were no longer people who could work the land. We weren't. The Beersheba people were the falachas. Falach, by the way, if I translate the meaning, means an agriculturalist, a farmer. But the Bedouins, when they talk about the falach, they are the owner of the land. Not only do they work and cultivate the land, but they're actually they're the proprietors, the landlords of that land. And that's very very, very important as far as I can. But what it made them feel was that it was a whole loss of trust and confidence and culture through that. And through that, from what they lost when they expressed it, you know what it really meant to them. Now, the land has significance from the point of view of sovereignty, self-control, clear, determined borders, self-determination, culture, the order of their lives, identities, values, a collective belonging, who the thing belongs to, the tribal structure, and also there's a whole issue of the hierarchy and the hierarchy with the various genders, and also black and white as well. So all that is all involved in it as well. Now, they describe, for example, how do the actual visits take place. We visit our places, and our houses still exist there, but there are also our burial places. We have to come and actually acquaint ourselves once again with where we had lived. They're bringing the stones when we come and visit that place. And when we come from Jordan, we want to go and visit our land. We bring our sand back with us so that we can feel the actual touch, tangibly actually touch upon our land. And I think that two things like that explain our emotional feeling. We're talking about people from the generation of 48. He was left alone of all his family, this man, and he said to me and my mother about how he was expelled and his testimony. And he said that everyone had to leave. First they left the men, and then the women and the children and the animals. And then we kept saying that someone has to actually guard the land. And then so it was most specifically, it was the elders, because they really believed that it was okay, this is our land. We don't want anyone to actually take us out of there and leave that place. But when we were forced to leave, so I told them all to go, and I myself walked barefoot upon my land to sense it and feel it. And one woman in Hawashle, which is near Dimono, she said to me that it's a very strong quotation that explains the emotional bond that I walked barefoot on my land to bid it farewell. So I bid it farewell while walking barefoot upon it to really feel it. And one of the most central issues that not all the people explained, but some of them did, and I come with a very critical kind of overview, so I keep trying internally and observing from the outside, but also from an internally. I'm doing it for myself, but also for research, and I also want a grade on it. After all, it's an academic project as well. It's a PhD, but people would open whole big files with aerial photography from the Ottoman period and from the British Mandate, and all sorts of documentation. I think it's as if they wanted to do that for the Jewish audience. In other words, we have proof in the establishment's language. We've got maps, marked maps. We've got very clear maps. In other words, it's as if they were translating it for the Israeli public. Everything is written on these pages, so that, and they really try and show that the nitty-gritty, and they're showing me the proof, but in the Jewish language. And one thing that I have experienced, and my children have experienced, and my husband has experienced this as well, and anyone in the Negev has also experienced that as well. And the way that we actually mark our place, following the footsteps of our grandfather, grandmother, father, mother, whenever we go somewhere, oh, here we were expelled from, here we went for 40 days, and that family went over here, and they lived with us for a few days. In other words, the women told us that they always tell their children, this is my land, this was my land, this is our name, this is the name of the land, this was our place, this is where my grandfather lived. In other words, it's an explanation that is an ongoing, and they can actually mark it with their, you pass by it, they mark it with their hand as well. In other words, they're saying the historical place as well, but they're also showing this was ours, this was our land. And this is really a reinforcement of their affinity, their real true bond with their earth. It's very important to me that this little child will understand what it means to us to learn, that we're taking him to Mother Earth, because this is where we were, this was ours, these are our borders, this is its historic name, this is where we lived, how we lived there, but we were expelled by force, we left there, but this is your land. So the significance is a reinforcement of that belonging to that land and strengthening his history or her history. And I didn't bring the actually Arab quotation, which they basically were saying is they wanted for them to become acquainted with their history. And as I said, the whole spatial discourse in the Negev takes place in two ways. On one hand, the strengthening of that belonging to the land, but on the other hand, the sense of alien sort of feelings around the place that they're actually in today. For example, keep saying that this is not our land. We didn't go back to our land. We are now foreigners. We are strangers, alien in our homeland. In order to explain that, in fact, we lost the place, and where we are today, we are just aliens. We are foreigners, strangers. In other words, there is a kind of, and there's a uniqueness in that kind of alien feelings. And although they have been here for over 60 years in that place, still the practice and the customs that they carry out is that they always talk about the place, they go and visit their place, and we keep saying no, but we still feel that we are foreigners there. And so this uniqueness of this kind of alien feelings, in other words, even the displaced people who live there, live actually beside their land. It could be entire tribes that live only 10 kilometers away, but they're not allowed to go actually into that place. So they still don't feel at home in where they are at the moment. In other words, my link and my bond with my actually land is so much stronger than the place that I am in now, because that is where I was born. This one is not. Even if I or my children were born, it's still, I don't want to improve where I live or renovate it or improve the quality of life or build on it, because it does not belong to me. I don't want to tile it. I don't want to do anything like that. They will be settled perhaps and seated beside a recognized village or settlement, because we don't want to invest anything in it, because we want to go back to our place. In other words, that feeling of being in a kind of state of exile from where they were. In other words, it's a disconnection from my feeling of a kind of dismantled identity. In other words, a land as an inseparable part of an integral part of who they are, and they want to return it to themselves. They keep mentioning it time and time again. They reiterate three main themes: how they lived in the past on that land, how it belonged to them, and the auda, the return, hashiva in Hebrew. We must go back. It is incumbent upon all of us. That is what we need. That is our vision. We want that vision to really come true. That dream to return to our tribal land. You know, they keep talking about people, you know, the Israelis say returning Palestine. No, it's not Palestine, it's the land that they want to go back. And there's a whole plethora of meanings to this documentation of the actual voices. And one of them, for example, is the fact that it's very important for the Arab audience and for the Bedouins in the Negev that the whole time people, as if the establishment is blackening to a certain degree, publicly demonizing the Bedouins as if they're being perceived as shepherds, especially shepherdesses, the women, despite the fact that we've progressed so much. And these research studies have such importance because we manifest in an academic research and we show it. And believe me, until I actually got the approval to write that, and now it's in the academe. You don't need to actually argue with me. Now it's already in that kind of form. So it's really giving. It's the hegemonious history is actually being challenged here, and the way it was manufactured and created, not only an oral history anymore, but it is sufficiently strong because it is being transferred from generation to generation, from my grandparents to myself. It's an ongoing, but I want real research papers that would truly document it so it will remain ad infinitum. In other words, you want to create a kind of history that we are actually actually researching, because we're documenting it through our cultural gender understanding, which is different through our culture, creating new knowledge, different kind of knowledge that really does voice the voices of the Bedouin in the Negev and locate them and in that period of the Nakba, because before that, but before their visibility and the indigenous kind of fight for their land, it is as if it belonged only to the Galilee and the triangular area in the north of Israel. But now they have transferred this presence of the Nakba to the Bedouin in the Negev as well. And in other words, under the auspices, and if we can actually impact it through the academic space, through a different kind of dialogue, and I want to stress the word dialogue, because in order to run a dialogue with us, and we want to have a dialogue with you, then we really have to understand the identities of each other, the culture of each other, even if there is some kind of paranoid kind of tendency amongst the Israelis. But there is an aspiration for equality, for balance, but you have to hear our tragedy and our pain and our meaning that we impose upon and pattern upon our affinity and our belonging and our sense of belonging to land.
Is that it?
I can do it. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for your passion, for your knowledge, for your information, for everything, your enthusiasm. It was wonderful. Now I'd like to give time to the Truth Commission to ask some questions. We are talking here about the Truth Commission, Truth Commissions, and about the historical narrative, which are part of the existing streams. In the last 14 years, there was a politicization of the Palestinians from 1948. How do you see the link between this swift process wherein there's a politicization of the Palestinian people, and how do you connect that to the oral history? And what is the solution that you could possibly envision? That I think during those years of 48, the last 14 years, there's been a, sorry, he's translating it now. I'm asking what the connection is between this process and the historical narrative that you have actually presented. And my question emanates from that point wherein these two streams, inter alia, influence how Palestinians, Israeli citizens envision the fair solution, the correct solution, the apt solution. If you could possibly, could you perhaps maybe explain it in simpler terms, please, your question? Could you simplify your question? Okay, in the last 14 years, Arabs in the State of Israel have undergone various things wherein they are reminded that they are not equal citizens. And for the youth and for the children, that makes them develop a more nationalistic kind of identity, much more accentuated, which isn't as deeply rooted. But they also come across the narrative that their parents tell them, that their families tell them. And this youth is the one that ultimately will be the one, I really believe, will reach that process of reconciliation. At least I hope they will. So what is the connection between that and how they envision the actual solution and how you envision it? Let's collect a few questions, and then we'll be able to keep to the timetable. It's a question about 1948. I still would like to go back to those events of 1948 During those interviews with that generation, did you come across stories, more specific ones, about what happened to them in 1948? Expulsion, displacement, attempts to return, things during the war and post-war, some more concrete examples, in other words, not just general stories about their belonging, but really specific events that took place that they remember.
أنا لاحظت في إحدى السلايد اللي عرضتيها اللي فيها نوع من التفاؤل.
I felt there's optimism. Even if we go after Israel, is that optimism to go back, the order, the return, is that something that you found in most of the interviews, or was that only in a minority? In other words, that optimism, were most of them or not optimistic? Just one question. Huda? I wanted to know if you heard stories from women about events that were specifically women events, in other words, that women perhaps underwent or experienced, not just that they all took us on trucks, but if a specific woman told you about any specific things that happened only to women, I'd like to hear about that if possible. Yeah.
אני אתחיל מהאירועים הספציפיים.
Yes, I have heard about specific events, but many specific events describing not only what people experienced during the war, but also stories of women telling what had occurred. My PhD doesn't include everything. I'm sure it can't include everything. And all of the quotes that I show you are selected quotes. Obviously, there are so many alternatives, and they are very valuable and of merit as well, I'm sure. During the war, particularly the women talked with great detail about the expulsion, meaning the period of expulsion, I said between was 48 to 53. It's quite a long period. Women talked in great detail about how their lives were, not only how they were expelled, I mean, great details about the expulsion. Very difficult stories to hear, not easy to hear me as well. I mean, for me to listen to them. And when I hear the injustices that had occurred, it was a harsh experience. The way in which they lived in hunger, the way that they needed approval and permits to move from one place to the next. They lived under the mercy of other tribes. I don't recall all of the details at the moment, but the way in which babies died on the way, the loss of animals, livestock, the fact that they didn't have anything to eat, and how they survived these difficult times, and what ways they dealt in order to cope. A lot of stories that talk about racial hierarchy, particularly in everything that has to do with the whites and blacks of the Bedouins. The blacks talked about this, and also the whites, that they perpetuated basically the racial classes between them also during the expulsion. Even when they had to hide in caves, they would leave the black women out, the black Bedouins outside, and the white ones would be inside, because what, white and black Bedouins would be in the same cave? No way. A lot of stories about children that died along the way. A lot. There's so much. One story that became a myth that was very dominant also in the Palestinian story in the north, where they forgot a child on a well when they went to get the water, or they they took a pillow instead of taking a child, and then they didn't manage to get back to the child that they finally remembered, and then the woman had died because she was so longing for a child, or somebody tried to get something to find to eat, and there was nothing to the woman couldn't breastfeed because she was malnutritioned herself. So horrific stories. I didn't bring you these stories. I didn't choose to bring them because I mean, you can address these testimonies from many perspectives, obviously. I address the fact, the racial point, because it really of great concern to me personally, about the fact that they perpetuated racial classes even during the war. I only brought you one quote that addressed the Falach the Falach in Beersheba versus we the Bedouins, particularly amongst the women, which was very, very clear. It was a narrative which was very dominant, the racial thing. In regards to optimism, it really doesn't stem from optimism. It really doesn't. No. It doesn't stem from optimism. People constantly ask, I'm asked as a researcher, and generally people asked, even I asked my father, because my father lives in Beersheba, but he has lands next to Kocholiv, and I always asked him that question, and he said, that's my strength, he said. It's something that I have to hold on to. Now, his inability to make this real to me made me try to make it real through my research, because when I try to talk to the Jewish Israeli, I need scientific proof to talk about the ownership of a land. When my father talks about emotion, about the heritage, about the rooting in the land, about the connection, when I have to flesh this out through research findings, I have to, it's not coming from optimism. It's not these people that they believe. These Arabs don't believe that they'll be back in Israel tomorrow, back in their lands. They don't. But for them, the land is an inseparable part of their identity, their history, who they are. It's something that was taken from them, and that's something that they will get back, that they will continue to pass on this importance from one generation to the next. It's not as if they're sitting around hoping that day after tomorrow they'll be back on the land, but they do perpetuate the Audi, the awareness of the connection to the land as part of their identity, which isn't transferred. Oftentimes people say, but how can they live in these conditions? How do they choose to live without water, electricity? Well, this is the price that they're willing to pay in order to live on their land. This teaches us about the significance of land to them. In regards to your questions, we were never equal in this country. The fact that now we're going to instate a law doesn't mean we were ever equal. We were never equal to the Israelis. I was never an equal to an Israeli, even though they constantly choose to tell me, here, look at you. You're a PhD. You look like me. You sound like me. We allowed you to be here. We the entitled people, allowed you to study this horrible, threatening subject. This kind of discourse shows that we're not equal. We've never been equal. We don't need the national law in order to tell us that there's inequality. This inequality has existed from 1948. The very turning our backs on history, the fact that I'm sitting here in college, it says, oh, stop, who cares about this subject? This is already discrimination because they're unfamiliar, they're ignorant. I'm talking about very educated people. In ignorance, for them, their lack of knowledge, and not only lack of knowledge, and disinformation that they have about us, which places them in regards to us in a certain relation, on a certain axis, because when you talk about the other, you talk about yourself. And when they say that, when they place me as inferior, they automatically make them superior, So we were never equal, not in the discourse, not in practice, not by law. Never there was equality. There was always oral history, though. There was always oral history transmitted from one generation to the next. We're the third, fourth generation of the Nakba. We always heard these stories. Now the existing generation in the Negev is beginning to document it. It has to do with our level of education, with our political and social awareness, which also the fact that we have identified a real significant need to document it for future generations. So my daughter knows it, and my son knows it, and everybody knows it. And even the Arabs, the Bedouins here in the Negev, have to know it, have to read about it, have to hear about it. Meaning, the politicization of this is not the last 4 or 5 years. I can tell you another process that began here in the last 35 years that has to do with education. The last maybe 40 years since the end of the military reign here that allowed us to study, to go to university, to leave the Negev, to become familiar not only with Palestinians and other Israelis, to really establish civil society here. So this process has brought us to a place in which we're beginning to wake up, to identify our needs and address those needs. Yes, the goal of this dissertation, this study, and others that we've produced, is to aspire to a kind of balance and perhaps equality, at least at discourse level, to voice the people of the generation of 1948 and to put it against the Israeli argument that that even disproves it, meaning we have academic critical tools that will allow us to talk on par. I think my study. Do you think my study is accepted? One of my judges on the judging panel of my dissertation said, "But haven't you talked about the? You look back to the nomad. You haven't even mentioned the fact that Bedouins are nomadic, and asking people why isn't talking about the nomadic nature, because that's what Israelis are interested in. This inability to accept even my methodology, meaning which is qualitative, which is feminist, which is gender-oriented. So this entire discourse is unequal, even and particularly in the academic sphere. But this does not stop us from coming and voicing our voice, voicing our opinions, and documenting things and holding up a mirror to Israeli society." Have you heard from men and women, particularly women actually, had they had any contact amongst themselves? Obviously contacts were made, but have they had any between those who expelled them, those who were there to expel them? I don't know if it was soldiers or police officers or whoever, and what happened in these interactions. Was there violence? I did hear horrific stories, particularly a very famous story about a sheikh from El Azayr who tried to talk. First of all, the men, this is mostly men's stories, but women as well also told me about the two things. First of all, their contact with the military personnel, particularly they have specific names, trying to have negotiations with them, who can we leave here. And some of the tribes did in fact remain, and they took and under the patronage of other tribes, and they left their names. Some were allowed to remain here 20, 30 years in the lands of other tribes, which create a lot of very strange kind of clan interrelations. I've heard a lot of massacre stories as well, that men would be put in a line and shot, that particularly the ways of expulsion, they would refuse to leave their lands, and then they would be shot at, and until they were wounded. Only after they were wounded would they be able to be pushed out of their lands. A lot of stories of men, particularly about the ways in which they fought against the military, the ways in which they tried to bribe the military people. Some families were torn apart and separated. Some went to Jordan. People who stood on the border for years, the Jordan border, which was different from where it is now. Some managed to infiltrate back into Israel, and some didn't. So lots of stories, very detailed stories of their contact with the Jews, particularly things of this nature. What did the women say? Stories that heard from the men. women had a lot less contact. Women more talked about the loss and how it impacted their life socially, culturally. The men actually told me these stories. Women did tell me what they'd heard from the men, how the men had fought against the military, how the men had been expelled, how the men massacred, and so forth. And obviously you hear the women who tell about the track that they took, the loss, their children, the livestock, what they lost on the way, where they were, how they survived. Women talked about survival mostly. That was the. I'd like to thank you very much, also because I personally learned a great deal from this lecture, and I think we all did. And there are young people here still in school, from 2 schools in Tel Aviv and in Jaffa, which are working on a communal project, and I think this is an amazing educational achievement just to teach them this aspect. Thank you so much for your contribution.
נורה?